Are they walking away? The words cut through the grand chamber like a blade, spoken in disbelief by Ambassador Kelkaran of the Valetic Dominion. His four clawed fingers tightened around the edge of his seat, the metal creaking under the strain. He had witnessed countless diplomatic collapses in his long service, but never this. Not like this. The 5 human delegates had already risen from their seats, their movements unnervingly synchronized. Ambassador Dorian Vex, the one they'd pegged as their negotiator, simply buttoned his navy blue coat, adjusted the sleek band on his wrist, and turned without a single word of protest. No rebuttal, no bargaining, no carefully crafted counteroffer. Councillor Voldrex 9, a towering Torellian with a shimmering bioluminescent carapace, extended 2 of his spindly appendages in an attempt to halt them. Ambassador Vex, surely we can... Vex's boots struck the marble floor like gunfire as he continued toward the exit. The other representatives exchanged glances, confusion, suspicion, then, slowly, dawning terror. No species walked away from the Galactic Council. No species had ever been offered probationary membership and declined. A sharp whisper from the Jarkathi delegation cut through the tense silence. They didn't even argue. Kelkaran swallowed, feeling his throat constrict as though he had just ingested ground glass. The scent of smoldering ceremonial incense coiled in the air, mixing with the lingering aroma of spiced oils the Thrani envoys used to polish their armor. Normally, these smells felt regal, a backdrop to power plays and veiled threats. Now the room reeked of something else entirely. Loss. Because if humans weren't negotiating, then they had already made their choice. Councillor Tethrak's crystalline form fractured with light, her distress radiating in pulsing bands of emerald. "This is a bluff," she hissed. "They think we will chase after them, improve the terms. It's manipulation. It has to be." Voldrex 9 shifted his bulk, mandibles clicking in rapid succession. "Then why does it feel as if we've made the greatest mistake in our history?" The chamber doors slid shut behind the human delegation, and for the first time in centuries, the council sat in absolute bone-deep silence. 23 seconds passed. Not a single being spoke. Then, suddenly, movement. A flurry of hushed, urgent conversations, data pads being retrieved, status updates flooding laser plasma displays. The Veltrian minister, always so composed, so regal, was visibly shaking as he activated his comlink. A diplomatic aide in the corner dropped a stylus, the faint clatter somehow deafening against the heavy silence. Kelkaran's primary heart slammed against his ribs as he forced himself to rise, turning to his own adjutant. "Get me a real-time update on human trade movements. Now." His assistant, a wiry Lutheran male with pale eyes, hesitated. "Sir, we already have one." Kelkaran snatched the display from his hands. A sick, twisting feeling curled in his stomach. The numbers were shifting too fast. Trade routes diverted, resource shipments rerouted to non-council worlds. Human supply chains vanishing from monitored space like ghosts slipping into the void. They had been preparing for this. He inhaled deeply, his sensory nodes flaring as the bitter tang of burnt silk filled his nose. Someone had knocked over a ceremonial torch. Normally, attendants would immediately rush to clean up such a disgraceful sight. But not now, not while the room was crumbling beneath the weight of realization. The Proximan envoy, usually so smug in his gilded robes, had gone rigid with dread. "They control 36% of the Council's rare metal imports. If they cut us off—" "They won't," Tethrak interrupted, her voice sharpening into brittle confidence like a blade about to snap. "They would cripple their own economy." Kelkaran narrowed his eyes, scanning the latest reports. No currency fluctuations, no drop in value. His blood ran cold. "They already found alternatives," he murmured. Tethrak's crystalline body pulsed violently in agitation. "That's impossible." "Then explain this." He threw the display onto the table. The images flickered, shifting between non-council species, signing independent contracts with human corporations. The Vorani, the Jukari, even the Zenthal, who had once sworn eternal loyalty to the Council's governance. They don't need us anymore. Tethrak stopped glowing entirely. In the back of the chamber, the doors hissed open once more. For a fleeting, desperate second, Kelkaran thought, hoped, that maybe Vex had changed his mind. Maybe this was still salvageable. But instead, it was a single human. A woman, clad in dark gray, her expression eerily neutral as she stepped forward. No insignia, no formal title, just a simple data pad in one hand, a disposable cup of steaming liquid in the other. Coffee. The smell reached Kelkaran's senses, earthy, rich, strangely unshaken by the turmoil surrounding it. The human took a slow sip, gaze flicking across the assembled dignitaries as though memorizing their faces for later reference. Voldrex IX's mandibles flared. "Who are you?" She set the coffee down, folded her arms, and regarded the entire council with the kind of detached amusement one might reserve for watching lesser creatures scurry in confusion. "Me?" she mused. "Oh, I'm nobody important." Her voice was calm, too calm. A bead of sweat slid down Kelkaran's temple. The woman's eyes glinted in the low light, and then she pressed a single button on her data pad. The laser plasma displays around the chamber blinked and flickered, suddenly broadcasting a live feed, not of council worlds, not of human fleets, but of ships belonging to the Arcath Coalition, the Galactic Dominion, and the Thrani Empire, council allies, stationed in human-friendly sectors. Docked, waiting, silent. Voldrex IX lurched forward. "Explain this, immediately." The woman tilted her head slightly. "They signed better contracts." A pause. Then she picked up her coffee again, flashing them all a smile so utterly devoid of concern that it felt like a slap to the face. "Enjoy the rest of your session," she said lightly. "I'd hurry up with that emergency summit if I were you." And just like that she turned, walking away. Kelkaran's claws dug into the table's surface. The council's chamber was built to house debates that shaped the fates of entire species. Now, it felt hollow. A grand theater, stripped of its actors. The silence left in humanity's wake felt less like an absence, and more like a warning. The chamber remained frozen, the tension curling around throats like unseen fingers. Councillor Voldrex IX had not moved since the human woman had walked out, his towering form locked in eerie stillness. The bioluminescent bands across his segmented body flickered erratically, a subconscious tell of disbelief, or perhaps the first shudder of fear creeping into his exoskeletal frame. Kelkaran forced himself to breathe. The chamber had become suffocating, thick with the scent of ceremonial oils, sweat, and the quiet rot of unraveling power. His gaze flickered to the laser plasma displays, where the unsettling feed still played. Docked warships, idle but not abandoned. Waiting, the human had left no further explanation, and none was needed. A sudden rasp shattered the silence. Ambassador Dorian of the Arcath Coalition pushed back his chair with an audible scrape, his heavy-set form looming as he turned sharply to Voldrex IX. "We need a full economic readjustment plan." His deep, guttural voice was laced with quiet urgency, as if speaking any louder might cause the walls to crack. Voldrex IX did not acknowledge him. His pupils, black slits against golden irises, remained fixed on the door the human woman had disappeared through. Borthan's thick brows furrowed. "Voldrex, do you hear me?" Finally, the Tyrellian stirred. His mandibles clicked, not in response but in slow comprehension of the disaster unfolding in real time. "They planned this." The words left his mouth more breath than speech. Kelkaran's fingers tightened against the cool metal of his chair. He could feel the weight of realization settling in the room like a thickening fog. "Yes," he murmured, his throat dry. "And we let them." Tethrak's crystalline form dimmed, her edges refracting dull light, as if even her luminous body could not hold clarity in the face of this catastrophe. "They are outnumbered, out-resourced. Their trade routes have been monitored for years." "Then explain why half the Council's economic trade partners just—" Borthan swiped his hand through the heads-up display on the central console, bringing up a new feed. "Diverted shipping lanes toward independent human-affiliated ports?" The numbers were shifting, dancing too fast to be a coincidence. Red lines marking council-supervised trade routes were collapsing while blue streams, independent, human-connected commerce, were growing like veins feeding an entirely new circulatory system. Tethrak inhaled sharply, the motion causing a high-pitched, resonant tremor through her crystalline structure. They built a secondary infrastructure, outside of our oversight. No, they didn't build it, Kelkaran whispered. The sinking weight in his gut turned to lead. They only revealed it. A silence followed, heavy with the recognition that the Council had never truly been in control, that humanity had been playing their own game while the Council remained content in its imagined dominance. The silence shattered as a sudden alarm blared across the chamber. Borthan twisted toward the laser plasma display, his thick fingers moving swiftly across the controls. A new alert flashed. Council Economic Stabilization Report, critical instability, detected projected trade deficit, 68.4% within 36 hours. Voldrex 9 finally jerked into action, his form uncoiling like a predator backed into a corner. Open a direct channel to their delegation, now. The aides scrambled, hands darting across consoles, sending urgent commands. The heads-up display flickered, sending out direct transmission requests to human diplomatic lines. No response. A second attempt. No response. A third. An automated message played across the speakers in flawless galactic standard, the tone so unbothered, so utterly detached, it felt like mockery. Thank you for reaching the Human Diplomatic Office. Due to recent policy adjustments, we are currently unavailable. For all trade and defense-related matters, please contact your nearest human trade representative. Have a productive solar cycle. The message ended, replaced by an unfamiliar rhythmic sound, deep bass strings plucked in slow, eerie succession, underscored by a faint, mockingly cheerful melody. "What is that?" someone murmured. Tethrak's form darkened, an effect akin to a human paling. "It's music." Kelkaran listened, the alien notes playing against the silence of the Council's defeat. The humans had not only walked away, they had locked the door behind them. Hours later, the Council had descended into barely contained chaos. The chamber, once a bastion of control, was now a war zone of frenzied data exchanges, shouted orders, and conflicting reports. Borthan had not left the communications hub, his face set in a stone-carved frown as he monitored updates. Kelkaran remained beside him, his claws tapping rhythmic patterns against the console, the motion betraying a tension he refused to voice. A sudden alert pulsed across the screens, drawing every eye in the room. Unauthorized military engagement detected sector, Therian Belt Council enforcement fleet dispatched. Voldrex 9 loomed over the display. "What fleet?" A hesitant aide checked the logs. "The Arcturian Armada, sir. They were ordered to secure human-controlled trade lanes." Borthan exhaled sharply, his large shoulders rising. "Someone authorized military intervention?" No one answered. But someone had. The Therian Belt was one of the most volatile trade arteries in known space, riddled with independent stations, mercenary-run fueling depots, and black market routes. The Arcturians were powerful, their ships clad in layered cobalt hulls, their reputation one of brute force and aggressive enforcement. But they were about to collide with something they did not understand. A new transmission intercepted the main feed. A voice. Human, male, unshaken. "To the Arcturian Armada, you are trespassing on independent space. Retreat immediately." The Arcturian Admiral's response came through seconds later, a low, static-laced growl. "Independent space? This sector falls under Council regulation. Human trade agreements are null. Stand down." There was a pause. A heartbeat of silence before the human responded. "No." Then, the screen exploded in data. Fleet displacement shifts, weapon signatures activating. The Arcturian Armada's vessels registering impacts before they even registered enemy positioning. Borthan's fingers clenched the console. What the hell is happening?" Kelkaran already knew. The humans had not built traditional warships. They had built something else, something that did not fight wars conventionally. And the Arcturian Armada feared across the council, was about to learn that the hard way. Before Kelkaran could speak, a final red alert blared. Arcturian Armada status, 67% fleet loss, 17 minutes since engagement. The chamber fell into complete, breathless silence. Then the display flickered, and one last message appeared from the human forces. Your move. The war had begun, and humanity had just played its opening hand. The Arcturian Armada had ceased transmitting. Not a distress signal, not a battle report, not even a fragmented scream through the encrypted emergency channels. Nothing. Kelkaran stood over the laser plasma display, his fingers curled against the edge of the console. The chamber was suffocating in its silence, thick with the scent of burned circuitry and the subtle musk of bodies running too hot under the pressure. Every species had their own way of sweating, oils, vapors, glandular secretions, and the air was now laced with the unmistakable stench of fear. Ambassador Borthan's breath came in measured exhales, slow, deliberate, like a man trying not to crack his ribs under the weight of realization. 67% of their fleet, gone, not routed, not disabled, gone. Voldrex 9 finally spoke, his mandibles shifting in uneven clicks. The usual iridescent sheen of his exoskeleton dulled. How? It wasn't a demand. It was a plea. Kelkaran exhaled sharply through his nose, forcing himself to focus. The feed had given them fragments, explosions recorded before enemy positioning, no registered incoming fire, no thermal spikes, no visible signatures from standard kinetic weapons. It was as if the ships had simply ceased to exist, erased from the battlefield by something unseen. His mind worked through the possibilities. Humanity had no superweapons, no recorded use of Singularity-class ordnance, no known fleet capable of this level of engagement. And yet, Borthan's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the console. What if they never intended to fight in a way we understood? Kelkaran turned sharply to him. Explain. The Arcathan ambassador's deep-set eyes flickered toward the heads-up display where the last transmission logs looped in quiet mockery. We assumed they would engage within our expectations, that they would meet our fleets, trade fire, play by the rules of war we've all followed for millennia. His throat moved, swallowing back some unspoken thought. But humans don't do that. They never did. A sharp, warbling tone sliced through the chamber, a fresh alert. Incoming transmission, human strategic command. 1,000 thoughts collided in Kelkaran's mind. A surrender? A warning? A declaration? Voldrex 9 straightened, the remnants of his shaken composure slipping behind a thin veil of authority. Open the channel. The heads-up display flickered once, twice, then resolved into an image of a human. A man, older, weathered, wearing the insignia of military command. He stood with a casual ease that made the entire room tense further, as if his lack of urgency was itself an unspoken threat. His face was lined, not with exhaustion, but experience, the kind that came from watching things fall apart and knowing exactly how to use the pieces. He folded his hands behind his back, nodding in the direction of the council chamber as if they were seated across from him at a negotiation table rather than a battlefield. My name is Admiral Callan Kessner, he said, his voice measured, unhurried, yet carrying an undeniable weight. Strategic Command, Terran Defense Initiative. He tilted his head slightly, an almost absent gesture, like a man listening to distant gunfire and knowing exactly where it would land. No theatrics, no bravado, no unnecessary words. You sent a fleet, he continued, a powerful one, experienced. And now it is gone. Voldrex 9's mandibles twitched, but he did not interrupt. Kessner's gaze sharpened, as if he could see them through the screen, picking apart the shifting expressions, the flickers of disbelief buried under controlled postures. There are 3 possible ways forward, he said. Option 1, you escalate. You mobilize more fleets. Throw them into the dark, hoping to see what killed the first. His eyes darkened. They will not return. Tethrak's luminous form shivered. Option 2, Kessner continued. You attempt diplomacy, real diplomacy, not the mockery you paraded before us. And you might find that humanity is more willing to talk than you deserve. A heavy pause. And then there's option 3. Kelkaran didn't realize he had stopped breathing until Kestner leaned slightly forward, his voice lowering. You continue pretending this is a war you can win. For a moment no one spoke. Then Voldrex 9 shifted, stepping toward the display. His form loomed, casting jagged shadows across the chamber's walls. You think you've already won? Kestner smiled, but there was nothing kind in it. I think, he said, you still don't understand what's happening to you. The transmission cut out. Silence slammed into the room like a physical force. Tethrak exhaled sharply, as though the atmosphere had thickened enough to choke on. He's bluffing. Borthen's jaw clenched. Are you willing to bet the entire Council's survival on that assumption? Kelkaran stepped back, his pulse drumming in his temples. It wasn't just the loss of the Arcturian armada. It was the nature of it. Humanity wasn't simply fighting. They were rewriting the concept of battle itself. Another alert rippled through the chamber. Multiple human fleets detected. Deployment unknown. Not engaging. Moving. Positioning. Preparing. And the Council had no idea where they would strike next. Voldrex 9 turned sharply, his bioluminescence flaring in erratic pulses. Order the remaining fleets into defensive positions. Reinforce all critical outposts. Tethrak hesitated. Where? Voldrex 9's pupils shrank to slits. Everywhere. A wave of orders surged through the chamber, transmissions firing off in rapid succession. Kelkaran kept his gaze fixed on the laser plasma display, watching as human forces continued their silent advance. They were moving with purpose, with deliberation, not striking recklessly. And that was the most terrifying thing of all, because humanity was still in its opening moves. The war didn't start with a declaration. It started with a whisper, a murmur across encrypted channels, a cascade of ships vanishing from known positions, a quiet shifting of battle lines before anyone realized they were being redrawn. Kelkaran stood over the laser plasma display, his breath shallow as new reports flickered across the screen. A dozen Council fleets had already repositioned, fortifying worlds they thought humanity would target. But the humans hadn't attacked. They had moved. And now the Council had no idea where they were. A single word appeared on the heads-up display, sent from an unknown relay. Checkmate. The message pulsed once, then disappeared, leaving nothing but silence and the reflection of Voldrex 9's unreadable expression on the display's darkened glass. "Intercept that transmission!" he snapped, his bioluminescence flaring erratically. "I want origin coordinates now." Tethrak's crystalline form fractured with dimming light, her fingers flying across the console. It's bouncing through a chain of relays across 3 sectors. It could be coming from anywhere. Kelkaran kept his gaze locked on the shifting fleet formations. The human forces were playing a game only they understood. No grand offensives. No declarations of territory. Just movement. Calculated, untraceable movement. A new alert cut through the chamber, sharp and urgent. Unauthorized fleet engagement detected. Sector: Varathis Perimeter Council forces engaging unknown human ships. Borthen slammed a fist against the console. Where the hell did they come from? A council fleet had been stationed at Varathis for months, a defensive position meant to prevent human expansion. Now that fleet was under attack, but the scanners weren't picking up enemy vessels. No incoming projectiles. No energy spikes from weapons fire, and yet ships were disintegrating in real time. Kelkaran's claws curled against his palm. "Get me a live feed." The display flickered, stabilizing into a direct combat transmission. The feed was static-laced, the audio filled with ragged breathing and overlapping commands, but the image was clear. Council warships were exploding one by one, without a single visible enemy in sight. Tethrak's voice was thin, almost hollow. "This isn't possible." Voldrex 9's mandibles clicked, rapid and uneven. "What are they using?" The answer came in the form of a desperate transmission from one of the surviving council captains. "They're inside our ships." A beat of stunned silence. Then, the captain's voice cracked. "I repeat, human forces are inside our ships. They bypassed the hull, bypassed all security." The transmission cut off. A flash of movement on the display. A Council destroyer split in half, debris spiraling in all directions. But it wasn't an explosion. It was controlled. Like something had ripped it apart from the inside. Tethrak exhaled sharply. "Boarding maneuvers? Through what? We have shields, security locks." Borthen's jaw clenched, his voice dropping into a heavy growl. "They're not breaking in. They're already there." Kelkaran felt the weight of those words settle like iron in his chest. The fleet at Varathas had been stationed for weeks, months. Humanity hadn't come to them. They had been waiting inside those ships the entire time. The laser plasma display updated, tracking the casualties in real time. Varathas Defense Fleet, 72% destroyed, remaining forces retreating. And still not a single human ship had been identified. Voldrex 9's bioluminescence flared with a sudden burst of anger. "We are the Council! We do not lose to creatures who have barely left their own system. Order full planetary lockdowns across all core worlds. I want every remaining fleet at high alert. Any vessel with human contact, destroyed on sight." The chamber descended into furious motion, orders relayed, commands sent, but the damage was done. Kelkaran turned his attention to the secondary feeds, watching as trade lines collapsed, as independent systems began withdrawing their support, as entire sectors faced economic blackouts before a single human military presence had even been confirmed. Borthen rubbed a hand over his face, his expression dark. "We thought this was a war." His voice was quiet but edged with something dangerous. "This isn't a war. It's an execution." Tethrak turned sharply toward him. "Then we counterattack. We find their fleets and—" Kelkaran laughed. The sound was brief, humorless, a jagged thing in the midst of panic. "You don't get it, do you?" He gestured toward the display, toward the rapidly disintegrating order of the Council's defenses. "There are no human fleets. They don't need them. They built a war that doesn't need ships, doesn't need battle lines, doesn't need conventional tactics." Tethrak's glow dimmed further. Then what are they fighting with? The answer came before Kelkaran could respond. Another message appearing directly on the Council's encrypted channels. A single sentence. "Your systems belong to us now." The chamber fell into chaos. Borthen's fists slammed against the console as security officers rushed to re-establish encryption barriers. Tethrak's form pulsed erratically, her datapads now completely inaccessible. The main display feeds flickered, shifting through corrupted files and distorted war reports. Kelkaran stepped back, his mind racing. The humans had never planned to fight conventionally. They had been inside for months. Not just their ships, not just their fleets, their entire system. Voldrex 9's voice cracked like breaking metal. "Find out where that transmission came from." But Kelkaran already knew. The answer was everywhere. A new symbol flashed onto the laser plasma displays. A sigil. Not a human emblem, not a planetary crest. A simple blackened insignia with no identifying marks. And underneath it, one final message. This was never your war to win. Tethrak stared at the screen, her form flickering like a dying ember. "What have we done?" Kelkaran inhaled, the air thick with the scent of burning circuits and failure. "We didn't start a war," he thought. "We walked into one that had already been won. And the humans? They were just watching, waiting, letting them struggle against a noose they had already tightened around their own throats. And the worst part? They had done it without firing a single shot. The Council's high command had ceased to function. Orders were issued, then countermanded. Entire fleets rerouted to defend locations that no longer mattered. Protocols collapsed under the weight of corruption, laced deep within their own systems. Malware so subtle, so intimately familiar with their architecture, that it felt as though their networks had turned against them. Kelkaran stood in the dimly lit war chamber, his breath shallow, his fingers curled into fists against the console. The laser plasma display flickered with the latest casualty reports, but he no longer needed to read them. The pattern had become clear. Humanity was never here to conquer. They were here to erase the Council's ability to resist at all. Ambassador Borthan's thick fingers gripped the display's edge, his dark eyes scanning the fragmented reports with a seething intensity. Every world outside of our direct control has gone silent. Trade routes are shifting in real time, not collapsing, just rerouting. Tethrak's crystalline form pulsed weakly. "They're not just dismantling us," she murmured. "They're replacing us." A single transmission cut through the Council's private network, bypassing every remaining firewall as if they had been built from brittle glass. "Surrender is unnecessary." The voice was human, male, unfamiliar. The accent was clean, unhurried, devoid of hostility or triumph. "We will not occupy your worlds. We will not destroy your institutions. You may continue governing yourselves, if you can." The heads-up display blinked once, then twice, before shifting to an orbital view of Council-controlled territories. One by one, entire sectors dimmed, not conquered, not bombarded, disconnected. Council-controlled economies severed from interstellar trade, defense outposts left in dead silence, their supply chains broken without a single shot fired. Kelkaran's throat tightened. He could feel it now, the way entire colonies were realizing at this very moment that they had been abandoned, not by the humans, by their own leadership. Voldrex 9 moved at last, his bioluminescent bands surging into a furious rhythm. "Cut them off! If they think they can dictate terms, they aren't dictating," Kelkaran cut in, his voice lower than he intended. "They're watching." A long silence stretched between them. Then another incoming alert. "Council High Fleet, engaging unidentified human forces." Borthan's breath left him in a slow, measured exhale. "Which sector?" Tethrak's glow flickered. "The core worlds." Kelkaran felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. If humanity had reached the core, the heart of the Council's governance and military coordination, then this wasn't an escalation. It was the final move. Voldrex 9 steeled himself, straightening his posture. "We're still the Council. We still have the strongest fleet in recorded history." Borthan's jaw tensed. So did the Arcturians. No one argued, because they all knew the truth now. The war had ended before it ever began, and humanity had never needed to fight it. The laser plasma display pulsed with a live feed from the core world's defenses. Council ships were mobilizing, engaging, but against what? There were no human battle lines, no conventional fleets meeting them in combat. And yet, ships were failing. Firing solutions corrupted, targeting computers feeding incorrect data, command orders redirected or outright ignored. One by one, Council warships were turning on each other, not from enemy fire, from false targeting data injected into their own systems. Tethrak's voice was barely above a whisper. "They're making us destroy ourselves." Another transmission overrode all frequencies, reaching every Council fleet, every command center, every world still under their control. "We understand your fear, but your greatest weakness is not your technology, not your military. It is your belief that power is absolute." Kelkaran leaned forward, the voice chilling in its detachment. "The war you feared never came, because we had no need for it." The display shifted, showing a final image. The Council's headquarters on Nexus Prime, still standing, still untouched, but surrounding it, dozens of human warships. Voldrex 9's mandibles clicked unevenly. "We still have forces," he said, but it sounded more like a prayer than a fact. Borthan's stare was flat. "And what do you think happens if we deploy them?" The heads-up display flickered once more. One final message. "You never realized the game we were playing." And then the screen went dark. Tethrak's fingers curled against the console, her glow almost completely extinguished. "They won't finish this." Her voice lacked certainty. "They'll leave the Council in place, crippled but intact." Kelkaran looked at her, then at the display, at the blank screens, the empty networks where once there had been constant movement, constant power, constant control. And now, silence. "They don't need to finish it," he murmured. Because the Council had already collapsed, not through war, not through diplomacy, but through irrelevance, and humanity had orchestrated it all. The silence stretched across the chamber like an open wound, raw and festering. The laser plasma displays flickered against the dim lighting, broadcasting nothing but empty channels and blacked-out sectors. Kelkaren's breath felt heavier than before, as if the atmosphere itself had thickened with the weight of their failure. He traced his fingers over the cold metal of the console, eyes scanning the void left behind by human interference. The Council's infrastructure had been methodically severed, piece by piece, link by link, until all that remained was a hollow framework of what had once governed thousands of worlds. And yet, the humans had not fired a single planetary weapon. Voldrex 9 stood rigid, his bioluminescence fluctuating between sharp pulses of cyan and deep bands of red, the Tyrellian equivalent of a body trying to recover from shock. He turned toward the others, mandibles tightening. "We are not finished," he growled, his voice raw. Borthon exhaled through his nostrils, his thick fingers still gripping the edge of the display. "We are." His tone lacked rage, lacked defiance, just cold, irrefutable truth. Voldrex 9's tendrils quivered. Then why are they waiting? Why haven't they declared themselves the new rulers? If they wanted power, they would have taken it by now. Tethrak's crystalline body refracted the dim light, the dull glow of her core flickering like a candle about to extinguish. "Because they don't need power," she murmured. "They just needed us to prove we never had any." Another alert snapped across the heads-up display, a final remnant of a dying network gasping for relevance. Council High Fleet detected near Sol. The chamber froze. Borthon's breath hitched. Which ships? The readout was a mess of corrupted data, numbers that refused to stabilize, as though the system itself struggled to make sense of the information. But there was no mistaking it. The last fully functional remnants of the Council's navy, 400 warships, the final hope of maintaining control, had taken course toward Sol. A desperate act. A final, reckless gamble. Voldrex 9 straightened, his gaze locking onto the screen. "If we take Earth, we take back control." Borthon's head snapped toward him. "That's what you think is happening?" He let out a harsh, bitter chuckle. "They wanted you to do this." Voldrex 9's pupils shrunk to thin slits. "You assume too much. And you assume you're still making decisions." Tethrak turned toward the display, watching the fleet creep toward Sol like an executioner lifting an already dulled blade. She whispered, "This is the trap." And no one in that room had the power to stop it. Across the core worlds, a single transmission flared to life. No human face appeared. No orders were given. Just a simple, unchanging set of words. You were given choices. The Council's fleet entered Sol without resistance. No planetary defense systems activated. No interceptors rose from human-controlled space. For the first time since the war had begun, humanity showed its hand, not with a fleet, not with a weapon, but with absolute silence. Council Admiral Zalvith's fleet, a behemoth of warships bristling with firepower, drifted forward, weapons locked on Earth, and nothing stood in their way, not a single human warship, not a single human response. Zalvith hesitated. He had expected resistance, expected the final dying screams of a civilization unwilling to bow. Instead, he found himself staring at a ghost of a battlefield. Empty space, silent planets, no transmissions, not from Earth, not from Mars, not from any of the human colonies. He reached for the console, his throat dry. Where is their military? The bridge crew scrambled over their stations, trying to confirm scans. The response came back in fragmented bursts of disbelief. "Sir, there are no human fleets present in Sol. No planetary forces, no orbital defenses, no nothing." Salvith's fingers curled against the metal. "That's impossible. Scan again." Another pause. Then, "Sir, there's no life signatures on Earth." A beat of frozen time. Then another. Zalvith's blood turned to ice. The humans were gone. The Council fleet drifted above an empty world. Earth was not destroyed, not burning, not scarred by war. It was simply abandoned. The great cities, once filled with lights and movement, now stood silent beneath an undisturbed sky. The great rivers still flowed, the forests still stretched into the horizon, but no human presence remained. Mars, Titan, Europa, every colony and soul echoed the same eerie silence. The humans had left. Voldrex Nine's mandibles quivered, his voice barely a whisper. Where did they go? Kelkaran closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the growing stillness inside the chamber. They moved on, he murmured, before we even realized we had lost. A sharp intake of breath. Borthan's gaze flickered toward the main display, his fingers twitching against the screen. If they left, then we've won. Kelkaran turned to him slowly. Won what? Borthan opened his mouth, but no answer came, because the truth was already sinking into their bones. They had not won. There was no victory. Only the realization that they had been fighting a war that had ended before it even began. Across the remaining Council-controlled space, the final piece fell into place. Human networks reactivated, not with threats, not with demands, but with simple confirmation of what had already happened. Trade alliances had shifted. Former Council members had already aligned themselves with independent human factions. The power the Council once wielded was nothing more than a memory. A final message appeared across every remaining functioning heads-up display, not a warning, not a declaration, just a single sentence. We are not your enemy, but you were never our equal. The Council, once the greatest ruling force in the galaxy, had been left with nothing, not by war, not by conquest, by irrelevance. And humanity? Humanity had already left them behind. The Council fleet remained in orbit above an empty world, paralyzed in the absence of an enemy. Sol was abandoned. Earth, untouched yet devoid of life. The colonies, silent. Every signal, every trace of movement, gone. Humanity had simply vanished. But Kelkaran knew better. People didn't disappear. Not like this. They relocated, and they had planned it. The realization settled into his bones like an unshakable weight. He turned from the display, the glow of its emptiness reflecting against his features. Borthan sat rigid, arms crossed, his fingers digging into his biceps as if holding himself together. Tethrak remained utterly still, the refracted light of her crystalline body barely shifting. Voldrex 9, however, was not ready to accept defeat. His mandibles clicked erratically, the shifting hues of his exoskeleton betraying the storm beneath his calculated exterior. They couldn't have left without a trace. He turned sharply to Tethrak. Their supply routes, their colony infrastructure, there should be residual energy signatures, recorded mass displacements, something. Tethrak's fingers flickered over the controls, her form dimming as she analyzed the available data. They covered their movements, she admitted, voice brittle. Whatever process they used to extract themselves, they wiped the logistical footprint clean. Borthan finally exhaled. Then they didn't just leave. His gaze locked onto Kelkaran's. They evacuated strategically. Kelkaran nodded. And that means they're somewhere. Voldrex 9's bioluminescence flared. Then we find them. Silence settled for a beat too long. It was a fool's errand, and everyone knew it. And yet it was the only move left to make. The chamber shifted back into motion. Commanders scrambled across the war tables, bringing up known human trade routes, possible migration paths, unexplored sectors where entire civilizations could slip through the cracks. Kelkaran studied the shifting maps with narrowed eyes. The humans hadn't simply relocated. That much was obvious. This wasn't an act of desperation. It was one of control. They didn't just pick a place and go, he murmured. They orchestrated their own disappearance as if they'd never been here at all. Tethrak's gaze flickered toward him, her crystalline features shifting in calculated thought. Then we track anomalies. She pulled up a detailed breakdown of Council-monitored space, searching for patterns outside of traditional movement. Trade convoys that had been rerouted months ago, subtly shifting their cargo routes away from Council-controlled pathways. Uninhabited sectors that had seen sudden gravitational distortions, subtle but measurable signs of megastructure construction. Regions previously deemed uninhabitable where energy outputs had begun registering, then vanishing just as quickly. They had built somewhere new. Voldrex 9's mandibles curled inward. We need to mobilize every available scouting fleet, divide search sectors based on these records, and establish contact points along. Borthon slammed a fist onto the table. And what happens if we find them? The chamber stilled. The words hung heavy in the air, challenging the very premise of their pursuit. Because what would happen? The Council had already lost. Its infrastructure had collapsed under its own weight, its fleets dismantled by their own incompetence. Humanity had not fled. They had simply stepped aside, abandoning a broken system that no longer had relevance. Kelkaran leaned forward, voice level. What is the objective of this pursuit? Retaliation. He let the word linger. Because let me ask you this. How do you wage war on an opponent who does not consider you worth fighting? Tethrak's glow pulsed once, then faded. Voldrex 9's eyes narrowed. You think we let them go? Just like that? Kelkaran's expression remained impassive. I think you assume we still have a choice. A new alert flared across the heads-up display. Unidentified human signal detected. Every head snapped toward the display. A single data packet had been left behind in the Sol system. No encryption, no elaborate protection mechanisms. It was meant to be found. Tethrak hesitated, then activated the message. A simple map flickered onto the display. One location, an uncharted system near the Andromeda Rift. Borthon's expression darkened. It's a lure. Of course it is, Kelkaran muttered. But that doesn't mean it's not worth following. Voldrex 9 straightened. We dispatch a fleet. Kelkaran turned sharply toward him. You don't send a fleet into an obvious ambush. We go in with scouts. Small, undetectable reconnaissance vessels. We watch, we track, we don't engage. Voldrex 9 bristled, his bioluminescent patterns shifting erratically. You expect us to watch? To sit idly while they dictate the terms of engagement? Kelkaran's jaw clenched. I expect us not to walk into the next step of their plan like cattle to slaughter. Voldrex 9's mandibles twitched, but he said nothing. Borthon exhaled. So we go. Quietly. Not as warriors, but as ghosts. The reconnaissance fleet launched within 2 standard cycles. A dozen cloaked scouting vessels, each equipped with passive surveillance systems designed to observe without detection. As they neared the Andromeda Rift, the first discrepancies appeared. Kelkaran sat aboard the lead scout, watching the live feed. The system wasn't empty. It was alive. Human ships weren't simply hiding. They were building. Massive orbital platforms stretched across the system, interconnected megastructures far beyond their previous engineering capabilities. Hundreds of stations, moving in perfect synchronization, forming a network that dwarfed the scale of the Council's oldest colonies. A fleet larger than anything the Council had ever seen, waiting in the void. This was not a remnant of a civilization in exile. This was a civilization that had moved on. Voldrex 9's voice crackled over the comms. They were never running from us. Kelkaran exhaled. No. The realization settled. Humanity hadn't just built a new home. They had built something better, a new empire, outside of the Council's reach, and they had left the door open just enough for the Council to realize how small they had become. The Andromeda Rift was silent, but the silence was no longer theirs to command. Kelkaran watched from the dim glow of the laser plasma display as humanity's new dominion stretched before them, an intricate, interwoven lattice of power far beyond what the Council had ever imagined. This was not a civilization that had fled, it was one that had transcended. Voldrex 9 had not moved for minutes, his posture rigid, his pupils mere slits in the dim lighting. His bioluminescence pulsed in tight, erratic patterns, a warrior staring at an enemy he no longer understood. Tethrak finally spoke, her crystalline voice subdued. We shouldn't be here. Borthon exhaled, slow and measured. "No," he admitted. "We shouldn't." The truth sat between them, crushing in its simplicity. The Council had spent centuries believing they were the center of civilization, that they dictated the laws of diplomacy, war, and power. But here, on the edges of an empire built in secret, they saw what humanity had been constructing while the Council played at control. The laser plasma display shifted. Movement. Not ships coming to meet them. Not battle formations adjusting. Simply a signal. A message, deliberately sent. Kelkaran hesitated, then accepted the transmission. The screen flickered once, then resolved into a single figure. A human. Not a fleet admiral, not a military strategist. Just a man. Older, the kind whose wrinkles had been carved by time and experience, his hands steady as he folded them before him. His eyes held no malice, only knowing. "You're late," he said. The words struck like a blade. Voldrex Nine's mandibles clicked, an unconscious sign of agitation. "Late?" The human smiled. It wasn't cruel, wasn't mocking. Just understanding. "You thought this was a war," the man said. "A battle between fleets, a contest of strategies and weapons. But it never was." He tilted his head slightly. "This was an evolution. And your council, you never realized you had stopped evolving." Kelkaran's throat tightened. "You assumed humanity wanted to replace you," the man continued. "That we sought your thrones, your governance. But we never did." His fingers tapped lightly against the surface in front of him. "We simply stopped needing you." A single, undeniable truth. The Council had spent centuries believing they were the architects of civilization, but civilization had outgrown them. Tethrak's glow pulsed erratically. "You dismantled the Council's power," she said, voice laced with something close to awe. "Undermined our fleets, our trade networks, our alliances." The human gave a slow, almost amused nod. "Yes. You crushed us," Voldrex 9 snapped. The human finally leaned forward, his expression shifting just slightly, not with arrogance, not with cruelty, but with something deeper. Pity. "We didn't need to." The silence hit harder than any weapon could. Kelkaran felt it now, like an unstoppable current pulling them all out to sea, drowning in a tide that had changed long before they realized they had been standing in the water. "You walked away," Borthon murmured. "From everything. The Council, the wars, the games of power." He exhaled slowly. "And in doing so, you became something greater than all of it." The human nodded. "You tried to define us by your standards, but we were never playing by your rules." Voldrex 9's voice was tight, controlled, but Kelkaran could see the fractures forming beneath the surface. "You think this is the end?" The human's gaze locked onto his, unwavering. "It's already over. No victory, no conquest. Just a simple, unshakable fact. Humanity had walked away, and in doing so, they had left the Council behind." The screen flickered, then faded to black. No final warning, no demand for surrender, no threat, because there was nothing left to threaten. Kelkaran sat back, exhaling a breath that felt decades old. It wasn't humanity that had been defeated. It was the idea that the Council had ever mattered at all. Borthon finally stood, his massive form casting a long shadow across the chamber. He turned toward Voldrex 9, his voice low. "There's nothing left to fight for." Voldrex 9 did not answer, because for the first time in his life, he had nothing to say. The Council was dead, and humanity had never needed to kill it. They had simply outgrown it.